The arrival of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Ghana has triggered a wave of questions across West Africa. Officially, Washington says the mission is straightforward. A team of FBI instructors has traveled to Ghana to help local law enforcement strengthen its ability to combat terrorism, organized crime, and transnational criminal networks. The training program is scheduled to last only 10 days. On the surface, it appears to be another example of international security cooperation. Yet many observers believe the timing is too significant to ignore. Why is this happening now? At a moment when the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, is gaining momentum. Why is an intelligence-focused program being launched in a country that sits directly south of Burkina Faso, one of the most influential members of the new alliance? And why does the training focus heavily on intelligence gathering, threat identification, and undercover operations rather than traditional policing methods? These questions have fueled intense debate throughout the region. Some see the FBI's presence as a legitimate effort to help Ghana address growing security threats. Others wonder whether a larger geopolitical game is unfolding behind closed doors. Before drawing conclusions, it is important to begin with the facts. According to official statements, the FBI training program involves officers from Ghana's Criminal Investigation Department and Police Intelligence Directorate. The curriculum includes intelligence collection, analysis of criminal networks, undercover investigations, proactive threat detection, and counterterrorism techniques. These are highly specialized areas that focus on identifying threats before they become visible. This detail matters because the program is not centered on routine policing. It is centered on information. In today's world, information is often the most valuable strategic asset. Whoever gathers it first gains an advantage. That reality is one reason why the FBI's arrival has attracted so much attention far beyond the borders of Ghana. Ghana occupies a unique position on the map of West Africa. To many outsiders, it is often viewed as one of the region's most stable democracies, a country known for peaceful elections, economic resilience, and growing international partnerships. However, when security analysts examine Ghana's location more closely, they see something else entirely. They see a strategic gateway positioned directly beneath one of the most important geopolitical regions in Africa today. To the north lies Burkina Faso, a founding member of the Alliance of Sahel States. Beyond Burkina Faso are Mali and Niger, the other two pillars of the AES Alliance. Together, these countries have become the center of a major shift in African politics and security. Their governments have pursued policies aimed at reducing foreign influence, strengthening military sovereignty, and building regional cooperation independent of traditional Western structures. This geographic reality makes Ghana far more significant than many people realize. Any organization seeking to monitor security developments in the Sahel naturally pays close attention to countries along its southern edge. Ghana provides access to transportation routes, commercial networks, communication channels, and regional intelligence flows that connect coastal West Africa to the interior Sahel region. From a purely strategic perspective, Ghana is positioned at a crossroads. Information moving between coastal states and the Sahel often passes through the same economic and security corridors. This is one reason why international powers have consistently invested in partnerships with Ghana over the years. For supporters of the FBI training program, Ghana's location explains exactly why enhanced security cooperation is necessary. If instability from the Sahel spreads southward, Ghana could become one of the first countries affected. For critics, however, the same geography raises different questions. If Ghana sits at the crossroads of regional information networks, could intelligence cooperation also provide valuable insight into the activities of neighboring AES countries? No public evidence currently supports such a claim. Yet, Geography alone explains why many observers across Africa immediately connected the FBI's arrival not only to Ghana's security challenges, but also to the broader transformation taking place throughout the Sahel region. To understand why the FBI's arrival in Ghana has sparked such intense discussion, it is necessary to look beyond Ghana itself and examine the extraordinary rise of the Alliance of Sahel States. Only a few years ago, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were often portrayed as fragile nations struggling with insecurity, political instability, and economic challenges. Today, they are attempting something entirely different. Through the creation of AES, these three countries are building a new regional framework based on military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and greater political independence. At the center of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Although still one of the youngest heads of state in the world, Traoré has become a powerful symbol for millions of Africans. His speeches consistently focus on sovereignty, self-reliance, and the belief that African nations must control their own destiny. Supporters view him as a leader willing to challenge long-standing systems that many believe have failed to deliver security and prosperity. Traoré is not acting alone. In Mali, Assimi Goïta has pursued similar goals, emphasizing military reform and national control over security decisions. In Niger, Abdourahmane Chiani has aligned his government with the broader AES vision. Together, these leaders are attempting to create an alternative model for regional cooperation. One of the most significant developments has been the creation of a joint AES military force. The alliance has also expanded cooperation in intelligence sharing, border security, and strategic planning. These efforts are designed to reduce dependence on external security structures and strengthen coordination among member states. For many young Africans, this movement represents more than politics. It represents a new vision of African self-determination. This growing influence helps explain why international observers closely follow developments within AES. As the alliance becomes more organized and more confident, its decisions increasingly affect the balance of power across West Africa. Against this backdrop, any new security initiative near AES borders naturally attracts heightened attention and speculation. The skepticism surrounding the FBI's presence in Ghana did not emerge in a vacuum. It is rooted in decades of experience, historical memory, and unresolved questions about previous security initiatives across the Sahel region. For more than 20 years, Western governments have invested heavily in counterterrorism programs throughout West Africa. Military partnerships, intelligence sharing agreements, training missions, and regional security initiatives have all been introduced with the stated goal of containing extremist violence and improving stability. Programs associated with international counterterrorism efforts expanded across countries such as Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Large amounts of funding were allocated, military advisors were deployed, intelligence cooperation increased. Yet despite these efforts, violence continued to spread throughout significant portions of the Sahel. For many Africans, this creates an uncomfortable question. If decades of international security involvement were successful, why did insecurity continue to grow in so many areas? Supporters of Western engagement argue that the threat environment became more complex and that without international assistance, the situation might have been even worse. Critics, however, point to the continued expansion of armed groups as evidence that existing approaches failed to solve the root causes of instability. These differing interpretations help explain why reactions to the FBI training mission have been so emotional. Among many citizens, the issue is not simply whether the FBI can provide useful training. The deeper concern involves sovereignty. Who controls information? Who sets security priorities? and who ultimately benefits from intelligence collected within African countries. For supporters of AES and the broader Pan-African movement, these questions are especially important. They believe that Africa's future security should increasingly be managed by Africans themselves. Whether one agrees with that position or not, it reflects a growing sentiment across parts of the continent. As a result, even a relatively small training program can become a symbol of a much larger debate about independence, partnership, and the future direction of African security policy. At this point, it is important to introduce a different perspective. While many observers question the timing of the FBI's arrival in Ghana, others argue that the situation may be far less mysterious than it appears. The first point they raise is simple. Ghana faces genuine security challenges. Although the country has remained more stable than many of its neighbors, officials have repeatedly warned that violence from the Sahel could spread southward. Armed groups operating in border regions have demonstrated an ability to move across vast territories, creating concerns throughout West Africa. From this perspective, strengthening intelligence capabilities is not unusual. Modern security threats are increasingly difficult to detect through traditional policing alone. Criminal organizations, extremist networks, cybercrime groups, and trafficking operations often operate across multiple countries. Intelligence-led policing has become a common tool used by governments around the world to identify threats before they materialize. Supporters of the FBI partnership also emphasize an important fact. There is currently no public evidence showing that the training program is designed to monitor Ibrahim Traoré, AES leadership, or the internal affairs of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Much of the speculation surrounding these issues is based on timing, geography, and political context rather than verified information. This distinction matters. Responsible analysis requires separating documented facts from assumptions. The confirmed facts are that FBI personnel are training Ghanaian officers and that the curriculum focuses on intelligence and counterterrorism. Beyond that, many of the more dramatic claims remain unproven. At the same time, skepticism should not automatically be dismissed. History has taught many Africans to ask difficult questions whenever foreign security interests become involved in regional affairs. The challenge is finding a balance between healthy scrutiny and unsupported conclusions. That balance is essential for understanding what may truly be unfolding across West Africa today. Beyond the debate surrounding Ghana and the FBI lies a much larger story. West Africa is becoming one of the most important geopolitical arenas of the 21st century. What makes this competition different is that it is no longer fought primarily through conventional military deployments. Today, influence is exercised through intelligence networks, economic partnerships, infrastructure investments, information campaigns, security agreements, and access to strategic resources. The United States remains a major player in the region through security cooperation and diplomatic engagement. China continues expanding its economic footprint through infrastructure projects, trade, and development financing. Russia has increased its presence through security partnerships and military cooperation. Meanwhile, regional organizations and African governments are pursuing their own interests in an increasingly complex environment. At the center of this shifting landscape stands the Alliance of Sahel States. The emergence of AES has introduced a new variable into the regional equation. Rather than aligning completely with traditional power structures, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are attempting to chart an independent path. Whether that effort succeeds or fails will have consequences far beyond their borders. This is why seemingly isolated events attract so much attention. A training mission in Ghana is no longer viewed only as a training mission. It is interpreted through the lens of a broader struggle over influence, sovereignty, and the future direction of West Africa. Some observers believe Ghana is simply strengthening its security capabilities. Others believe the country may become an increasingly important frontline state in a growing competition for information and strategic influence. Whatever the truth may be, one fact is becoming difficult to ignore. The future of West Africa is being shaped not only by events on the battlefield, but also by decisions made in intelligence centers, government offices, and diplomatic negotiations. The contest for influence has already begun, and every major actor appears determined to secure a place in the region's future. The arrival of the FBI in Ghana may have started as a security story, but it has evolved into a much larger discussion about sovereignty, influence, and the future of West Africa. Several facts are clear. FBI personnel are currently training Ghanaian officers in intelligence gathering, threat identification, undercover operations, and counterterrorism methods. Ghana's government presents this partnership as an effort to strengthen national security and prepare for emerging threats. At the same time, no public evidence has been presented showing that the mission is intended to monitor the alliance of Sahel states or target its leaders. Yet questions remain. Those questions exist because Ghana occupies a strategic position near Burkina Faso. They exist because AES is becoming an increasingly influential force in regional politics. They also exist because many Africans remember previous foreign security initiatives that produced results far below expectations. The deeper lesson extends beyond one training program. African nations must continuously balance international cooperation with the protection of national interests. Partnerships can provide expertise, technology, and resources. However, long-term stability depends on building strong local institutions, capable security systems, and independent decision-making. The experiences of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have sparked an important continental conversation. Citizens across Africa are increasingly asking how their countries can strengthen sovereignty while remaining engaged with the world. That discussion sits at the heart of modern Pan-African thought. As the African Union and regional leaders shape the future, figures such as Captain Ibrahim Traoré continue to influence debates about self-reliance, development, and Pan-Africanism. Whether admired or criticized, Ibrahim Traoré and the changes taking place in Burkina Faso have become part of the broader Africa new narrative emerging across the continent. The story is still unfolding. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel and continue following our coverage of AES, Burkina Faso, and the future of Africa.
France was expelled from the Sahel. French troops left Mali. They left Burkina Faso. They left Niger. Convoys crossed the desert while crowds celebrated in the streets. Across the region, many people believed a long chapter of foreign military influence was finally coming to an end. But then a new and uncomfortable question began spreading across Africa. If France truly lost the Sahel, why does Paris still help write the rules about the Sahel inside the United Nations? That question is at the center of one of the biggest geopolitical shifts happening in Africa today. While AES soldiers continue fighting armed insurgents across the Sahel, France still holds enormous diplomatic influence inside the United Nations Security Council. Even after being pushed out militarily, Paris remains deeply connected to the international structures shaping how the world discusses Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Most people never hear about something called the penholder system. But inside the Security Council, the country holding the pen often controls the narrative. It drafts resolutions. It shapes diplomatic language. It influences how crises are presented to the world. And for years, France held that role on key Sahel files. To many Africans, this feels like a new version of an old system. The soldiers may leave, but the power remains behind. That is why the Alliance of Sahel States is no longer asking only for military sovereignty. It is asking a far bigger question. Who truly has the right to define Africa's future? If you want to understand the hidden power structures shaping Africa today, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. For more than a decade, the Sahel became one of the most heavily militarized regions in Africa. France deployed troops. The United States expanded security cooperation. The European Union invested billions of euros. The United Nations launched MINUSMA, one of its largest peacekeeping missions in the world. The promise was simple. Terrorism would be contained. Stability would return. Democracy would survive. But the reality became something very different. Instead of declining, violence across the Sahel exploded. Terror-related deaths rose from roughly 5,400 people in 2017 to more than 25,000 by 2024. Today, the Sahel accounts for more than half of all terrorism-related deaths worldwide. For many people living in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, those numbers destroyed trust in the old security system. The frustration became even deeper with MINUSMA. The mission was originally presented as a peacekeeping solution. But many citizens and officials inside Mali began accusing it of failing to stop armed groups while focusing heavily on reports against local military operations. From the perspective of the Malian government, international institutions seemed more interested in monitoring state actions than defeating insurgents expanding across villages and border regions. At the same time, ECOWAS increasingly became viewed by many Sahel citizens as a political instrument aligned with foreign pressure rather than local realities. Sanctions and diplomatic ultimatums only intensified public anger. This is the part many outsiders fail to understand. People do not celebrate military takeovers because they love instability. Many support them because they feel the previous system already failed completely. And once that belief spreads across a population, the entire political order begins to collapse from within. As military governments took power across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, something unusual began happening across Africa. Instead of total condemnation from ordinary citizens, many people reacted with support, celebration, and even hope. To outsiders, that reaction seemed shocking. But inside the Sahel, many citizens believed the old political order had already collapsed long before the coups happened. For years, people watched insecurity spread while foreign troops remained present across the region. Villages were attacked. Trade routes became dangerous. Entire communities were displaced. Yet despite billions of dollars in international assistance, daily life continued becoming more unstable. That frustration created fertile ground for a completely different political message. The Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, began presenting itself not simply as a military alliance, but as a sovereignty project. Its leaders argued that the Sahel could no longer depend on foreign powers to define security, diplomacy, and development. That message spread rapidly because it connected with a deeper emotional reality across Africa. Many Africans feel their countries gained independence politically decades ago, but never fully gained strategic independence economically or militarily. AES leaders understood that frustration. Instead of speaking the language of international institutions, they began speaking the language of dignity, sovereignty, and self-determination. For many supporters, this was not about rejecting cooperation with the world. It was about rejecting dependence. And that is why AES has become far more than a regional alliance. It is increasingly viewed as a symbol of resistance against a system many Africans believe still treats the continent as a managed space rather than an equal power. Whether AES succeeds or fails remains uncertain. But one thing is already clear. The political conversation inside Africa is changing very fast. No leader symbolizes this new political mood in Africa more than Ibrahim Traoré, young, direct, and openly defiant toward foreign influence. The leader of Burkina Faso has become one of the most recognizable political figures on the African continent. To supporters, he represents something far bigger than a military government. He represents the return of African self-confidence. Across social media, many young Africans compare him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former leader of Burkina Faso who became famous for promoting self-reliance and resisting foreign domination during the 1980s. The comparison is powerful because both men speak the language of sovereignty. Traoré regularly speaks about dignity, economic independence, control over natural resources, and the need for Africans to stop waiting for outside powers to solve African problems. In a continent where many citizens feel frustrated by decades of dependency and instability, those words carry enormous emotional weight. And Burkina Faso is not standing alone. Ouagadougou has repeatedly declared that it will stand beside Mali and Niger if external pressure against AES continues growing. That message transformed AES from a temporary security arrangement into something more ideological and symbolic. To many supporters across Africa, AES is beginning to look like the early shape of a new Pan-African movement centered on sovereignty rather than foreign alignment. But this is also where the story becomes more complicated. Western governments argue that military-led governments risk weakening democratic institutions and increasing authoritarian rule. Critics also warn that emotional nationalism alone cannot solve terrorism, poverty, or economic fragility. Those concerns are real. Still, the popularity of Ibrahim Traoré reveals something deeper that many global powers may have underestimated. A growing number of Africans are no longer asking whether the old system should change. They are asking how far that change should go. As France lost military influence across the Sahel, another global power quietly expanded its presence. That power was Russia. For the leaders of AES, the shift toward Moscow was driven by one simple calculation: the previous security model had failed. After more than a decade of Western intervention, violence continued spreading while public frustration exploded across the region. Russia arrived offering something different. Instead of long political conditions and public pressure campaigns, Moscow presented itself as a partner focused primarily on security cooperation. Wagner forces, later reorganized under Africa Corps, expanded operations inside Mali, while Russian military ties deepened across Burkina Faso and Niger. To many supporters of AES, this looked like a strategic correction, but to Western governments, it looked like the opening of a new geopolitical front in Africa. And this is where the situation becomes extremely complicated. France may have lost ground militarily, but inside the United Nations Security Council, Paris still holds major diplomatic influence. At the same time, Russia also holds a permanent seat on the council. That means the Sahel crisis is no longer only about terrorism or regional instability. It is increasingly connected to a wider global rivalry between major powers. In many ways, the Sahel has become a chessboard where international powers compete for influence while local governments struggle to preserve sovereignty. That raises a difficult question many Africans themselves are now debating openly. If dependence on France created one kind of vulnerability, could dependence on Russia create another? This is why the future of AES remains uncertain. The alliance is trying to escape the old system while avoiding becoming trapped inside a new one. And history shows that balancing between global powers has never been easy for smaller nations. The deeper this crisis grows, the more one question continues shaking the international system. Who is truly protecting the Sahel? Western governments argue that they are defending democracy, human rights, and regional stability. AES governments respond that those promises mean little if ordinary people continue dying while insecurity spreads year after year. That disagreement now sits at the center of a growing diplomatic confrontation. For leaders inside Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the issue is no longer only terrorism. It is about who gets to define legitimacy in Africa. Is legitimacy determined by elections recognized abroad, or by governments that claim they are protecting national survival during a security collapse? The African Union itself now faces an uncomfortable dilemma. On one side, it must defend constitutional order and oppose military takeovers. On the other side, it cannot ignore the reality that many citizens across the Sahel believe the old political system failed them long before the coups happened. At the United Nations, this battle increasingly looks like a war over narratives. One side speaks about democracy and international norms, the other speaks about sovereignty and post-colonial control. And somewhere in the middle are millions of civilians simply trying to survive violence that has consumed the region for years. This is why the Sahel crisis matters far beyond West Africa. It is forcing the world to confront a dangerous and unresolved question. Can African nations truly control their own security and political future inside an international system still dominated by global powers? That question may shape not only the future of AES, but the future of African sovereignty itself. The struggle unfolding across the Sahel is no longer just a regional crisis. It is becoming one of the most important political tests Africa has faced in generations. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are attempting something extremely difficult. They are trying to build security independence while resisting pressure from both old and emerging global powers. They are trying to prove that African nations can defend themselves, control their resources, and shape their own diplomatic future. But history shows that sovereignty is never free. AES now faces economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, security threats, and enormous international scrutiny. If the alliance succeeds, it could inspire other African nations to rethink their relationships with external powers. If it fails, critics will point to the Sahel as proof that breaking from the old system only creates deeper instability. That is why the world is watching so closely. This story is no longer only about France. It is no longer only about Russia. It is about whether Africa can truly write its own future inside a global order still heavily influenced by stronger nations. And perhaps that is why figures like Captain Ibrahim Traoré have become so symbolic far beyond Burkina Faso itself. For many supporters of Pan-Africanism, he represents a generation no longer willing to accept that Africa must always remain dependent on outside protection or outside approval. The African Union now faces historic pressure as the continent searches for a balance between constitutional order, security, and sovereignty. Whether people support AES or oppose it, one reality is becoming impossible to ignore. New political conversations are emerging very quickly, and the debate around Pan-African sovereignty, Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, and the future of the Sahel may shape the direction of the continent for many years to come. If you believe Africa should have the right to shape its own future, subscribe and join us in the next conversation.
Look at the map of West Africa today. Look closely at Mali. Look at Burkina Faso. Look at Niger. Across the Sahel, something extraordinary is happening. Nations that once depended heavily on foreign military partnerships are now attempting to build their own path. They are closing doors that remained open for decades. They are speaking the language of sovereignty, self-reliance, and national control. Then suddenly, another headline appears. While the alliance of Sahel states continues moving toward greater independence, Ghana has signed a historic security and defense partnership with the European Union and accepted a package worth €50 million, approximately $54 million. The package includes surveillance drones, anti-drone technology, intelligence systems, communications equipment, and border security support. For some observers, this is a smart and practical decision designed to strengthen Ghana's security. For others, it raises uncomfortable questions about whether Europe is finding a new foothold in West Africa after losing influence in the Sahel. So what is really happening? Is this a security partnership that will make Ghana stronger, or is it the beginning of a new geopolitical struggle that could reshape the future of West Africa? Today, we will examine the details of the €50 million agreement, explore why the European Union suddenly considers Ghana so important, and ask whether this deal represents protection, partnership, or something much bigger. And if you appreciate honest discussions about Africa's changing political landscape, make sure you follow the channel because the story unfolding today may influence the future of the entire region. The agreement itself immediately attracted attention across Africa. Ghana became the first African nation to establish this type of formal security and defense partnership with the European Union. The support package includes advanced surveillance drones, anti-drone systems, intelligence equipment, electronic warfare capabilities, communication technology, and resources for security forces operating near the northern border. On paper, it looks like a major investment in Ghana's safety, but across West Africa, many people were not simply looking at the equipment. They were looking at the timing. And that timing is what transformed a security agreement into one of the most debated geopolitical developments in the region. The question many Africans are asking today is simple. Why is Europe suddenly so interested in Ghana? To answer that question, we have to look beyond Accra and examine what has happened across the Sahel over the past few years. For decades, Western governments maintained significant security influence in countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Military missions, training programs, intelligence cooperation, and foreign bases became major features of the regional security landscape. The stated objective was clear: fight terrorism, strengthen stability, and support local governments. But something changed. Military transitions took place in all three countries. New leaders emerged. Public frustration grew. Many citizens began questioning whether years of foreign involvement had actually improved security conditions. Instead of seeing progress, many communities continued to face violence, instability, and displacement. As political attitudes shifted, the relationship between the Sahel states and Western powers began to deteriorate. Foreign military forces were asked to leave. Long-standing partnerships weakened. Western influence across the region declined dramatically. This is where Ghana enters the story. Unlike the alliance of Sahel states, Ghana has remained politically stable and continues to maintain strong relationships with international partners. Geographically, it occupies a strategic position along the Gulf of Guinea while sharing regional security concerns connected to instability further north. From a European perspective, Ghana offers something valuable. It is stable, cooperative, and strategically located. Supporters of the new partnership argue that this is simply common sense. If security threats are moving southward, then cooperation should also move southward. They see the agreement as preventive action designed to stop instability before it reaches Ghanaian communities. Critics see a different picture. They argue that after losing influence in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Europe needed a new partner capable of maintaining visibility in the region. In their view, Ghana is not merely receiving assistance. It is becoming an important strategic platform in a changing geopolitical landscape. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, one fact remains impossible to ignore. The timing of this partnership has transformed a security agreement into a much larger debate about influence, sovereignty, and the future direction of West Africa. At the center of this controversy is a question that neither supporters nor critics can completely ignore. Does Ghana genuinely need this partnership? The answer is more complicated than many people are willing to admit. Unlike some of the emotional debates taking place online, Ghana faces real security concerns. The northern regions of the country sit close to areas affected by instability in the Sahel. Security experts have repeatedly warned that violent extremist groups operating in neighboring regions could attempt to expand their influence further south. From the perspective of Ghanaian policymakers, preparing for future threats is not optional. It is a responsibility. This is exactly why officials in Accra welcomed the new partnership. Advanced surveillance drones can improve border monitoring. Anti-drone systems can help defend sensitive infrastructure. Intelligence equipment can strengthen early warning capabilities. Communication systems can improve coordination among security forces. Viewed through this lens, the agreement appears practical rather than political. The European Union presents a similar argument. European leaders argue that security challenges no longer stop at national borders. Terrorism, organized crime, cyber threats, and illegal trafficking affect multiple regions simultaneously. According to this view, supporting Ghana contributes to stability across both West Africa and Europe. Yet critics remain skeptical. They point out that security partnerships often involve more than equipment. Modern intelligence systems collect information, surveillance systems generate data, communication networks create access points. The key question becomes who ultimately controls those capabilities. If the technology comes from abroad, who manages upgrades? Who controls technical support? Who has access to sensitive information? Who determines long-term operational standards? These questions do not automatically mean the partnership is harmful, but they explain why many Africans are debating the issue so intensely. The real discussion is no longer about drones or equipment. It is about strategic independence. Can a nation strengthen its security through foreign cooperation while still maintaining complete control over its own future? That question may ultimately determine how history judges Ghana's decision. The debate surrounding Ghana's agreement with the European Union becomes even more interesting when we compare it with the path chosen by the Alliance of Sahel States. Today, West Africa appears to be developing two very different visions for its future security architecture. The first vision is represented by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Rather than relying heavily on external military partnerships, these countries are attempting to build collective security through regional cooperation. The Alliance of Sahel States was created with the goal of strengthening military coordination, intelligence sharing, and joint operations among its members. Their leaders argue that African nations must become the primary defenders of African security. Supporters of this approach believe genuine sovereignty requires control over military planning, intelligence gathering, and strategic decision-making. They argue that dependence on foreign security structures can create vulnerabilities that eventually limit national freedom of action. The second vision is represented by Ghana's recent partnership with the European Union. Instead of reducing international cooperation, Ghana has chosen to deepen it. Supporters believe modern security threats are too complex for any country to face alone. Access to advanced technology, training, intelligence support, and financial resources can strengthen national defenses and help prevent future crises. Neither model is entirely without merit. The AES approach offers greater strategic independence, but also requires significant financial resources, military capacity, and long-term political commitment. Building self-sufficient security institutions is a difficult process that may take many years. The Ghana approach provides immediate access to valuable capabilities and expertise. However, critics worry that long-term reliance on external partners could gradually weaken strategic autonomy. This is why the current debate extends far beyond Ghana itself. West Africa is becoming a testing ground for two competing philosophies. One prioritizes self-reliance even when the road is difficult. The other prioritizes partnership even if it raises concerns about dependence. The outcome of this debate may influence how future generations of African leaders define security, sovereignty, and national development throughout the continent. To fully understand why this agreement generated such strong reactions, we must look at the leaders who have come to symbolize the movement for greater sovereignty in the Sahel. No figure has captured more attention in recent years than Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. To his supporters, Traoré represents a new generation of African leadership. His message consistently focuses on self-reliance, national dignity, and reducing dependence on external powers. Whether people agree with him or not, his popularity has transformed him into one of the most influential political voices in contemporary African debates. From the perspective of many Traoré supporters, the critical issue is not the 50 million euros. The real issue is control. Who owns the technology? Who controls the data? Who determines how security systems operate in the future? Those questions often matter more than the value of the equipment itself. Similar ideas can be found in the approaches of Mali's Assimi Goïta and Niger's Abdourahmane Chiani. Both leaders have promoted the argument that national security must remain under national command. They believe foreign partnerships should support local institutions rather than become the foundation upon which security depends. This explains why many supporters of the Alliance of Sahel States reacted strongly to Ghana's decision. To them, the agreement appears to move in the opposite direction from the path currently being pursued by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. While the AES seeks greater control over its security systems, Ghana has chosen deeper engagement with an external partner. Of course, supporters of Ghana's position would argue that sovereignty and cooperation are not mutually exclusive. A country can work with international partners while still protecting its national interests. Yet the disagreement remains significant because it reflects two very different visions of Africa's future. One vision seeks maximum autonomy. The other seeks strategic partnerships. The debate surrounding Ghana's agreement is ultimately a debate about which vision will shape the next chapter of West African history. The controversy surrounding the Alliance of Sahel States does not end within Africa. It has also generated strong reactions from Western governments, policy experts, and international organizations. Critics of the AES argue that the alliance risks isolating itself from valuable international partnerships. They claim that reducing cooperation with traditional security partners could weaken counterterrorism efforts, limit access to resources, and create new economic challenges. According to this perspective, modern security threats are global in nature. No nation can address them entirely alone. International cooperation is viewed not as a weakness but as a necessity. Supporters of the AES offer a different response. They point to decades of foreign military involvement across parts of the Sahel and ask a simple question: if the previous model was successful, why did insecurity continue to spread? Many supporters argue that the issue is not cooperation itself. The issue is dependence. They believe African nations should be able to choose partnerships from a position of strength rather than necessity. This distinction is important. The debate is not between isolation and cooperation, it is between partnership and reliance. For Ghana, and for other African countries, the lesson may be straightforward. International support can provide valuable tools, training, and resources. However, long-term security remains strongest when local institutions maintain control over strategy, decision-making, and national priorities. As West Africa continues to evolve, every country will face the same challenge. How do you benefit from global partnerships without surrendering strategic independence? That question may become one of the defining issues of Africa's future. As we reach the end of this discussion, one thing becomes clear: the debate surrounding Ghana's €50 million agreement with the European Union is about far more than money, drones, or security equipment. At its core, this is a debate about the future direction of West Africa. On one side, Ghana has chosen a path that embraces international cooperation, advanced technology, and strategic partnerships. Supporters believe this approach can strengthen national security and help the country prepare for threats that continue to emerge across the region. On the other side, the Alliance of Sahel States is pursuing a different vision. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are attempting to build greater self-reliance, greater control over security policy, and greater independence from external influence. Their leaders argue that true sovereignty requires national command over the institutions responsible for protecting the nation. Neither path is without risks. Partnership can bring resources, expertise, and immediate capabilities. But dependence can become a burden if control slowly shifts away from national institutions. Autonomy can strengthen sovereignty and national confidence. But self-reliance also demands patience, sacrifice, and the ability to overcome difficult challenges without outside assistance. That is why the real question is not whether Ghana should accept 50 million euros. The real question is whether Ghana can accept assistance while maintaining complete control over its strategic future. The answer to that question will not only affect Ghana, it may influence the future of Pan-African thought, the evolution of the African Union, and the broader conversation surrounding Pan-Africanism throughout the continent. As nations such as Burkina Faso continue to promote a new vision of sovereignty under leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and as voices supporting Africa, new political thinking continue to grow, the choices made today will shape the continent for decades to come. Whether one agrees with Ibrahim Traoré and the Alliance of Sahel States or supports Ghana's approach, every African nation faces the same challenge. How do you engage the world without losing control of your own destiny? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy serious discussions about African geopolitics, strategic independence, and the future of the continent, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next conversation.
The message came from Ouagadougou, but its echo traveled far beyond Burkina Faso. Independence always comes with a price. With those words, Iran's ambassador to Burkina Faso sent a direct signal not only to Africa, but also to Washington, Paris, and every global power watching the Sahel region with growing concern. At a time when Iran faces sanctions, military pressure, and diplomatic isolation, and Burkina Faso continues to battle insecurity and economic hardship, the two nations are openly moving closer together instead of stepping back. For many observers, this partnership looks surprising. One country has spent decades resisting Western pressure in the Middle East. The other is a poor African nation struggling against terrorism and political instability. Yet both governments now speak the same language of sovereignty, resistance, and national dignity. Iran believes Burkina Faso and the Alliance of Sahel States represent something larger than a temporary political movement. Tehran sees a new generation of African leaders refusing to accept the old balance of power. And at the center of that transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To supporters, he represents courage and African self-respect. To critics, he represents dangerous nationalism and military rule. But whether admired or feared, his influence is spreading far beyond Burkina Faso. If you want to understand the silent geopolitical revolution reshaping Africa today, make sure to subscribe and stay with us until the end. Iran has lived under sanctions and international pressure for decades. Its economy has suffered, its banking system has been restricted, and its leaders have repeatedly faced threats from Western powers. Yet despite all of that pressure, Tehran has never accepted the idea of surrendering its political independence. That long experience is one reason why Iran now sees something familiar in the governments of the Sahel. For Iranian officials, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not simply military governments trying to survive temporary crises. They are part of a larger movement challenging the old geopolitical order in Africa. When Iran's ambassador declared that independence always comes with a price, he was speaking from the perspective of a country that believes survival under pressure is itself a form of victory. This explains why Tehran continues strengthening ties with Burkina Faso, even while facing serious tensions in the Middle East. Iran sees strategic value in building alliances with countries that reject outside control and seek alternative partnerships beyond Western influence. Instead of offering aid with political conditions attached, Tehran presents itself as a partner that understands isolation, sanctions, and resistance. At the same time, Burkina Faso also benefits from this relationship. The government of Captain Ibrahim Traoré wants to show the world that it is not alone, despite growing criticism from Western nations. By standing publicly beside Iran, Burkina Faso sends a message that it is willing to explore a new diplomatic path built around sovereignty and national dignity rather than dependency. For supporters of this alliance, the message is simple. Poor nations may lack money and military power, but they do not have to abandon their pride or their right to choose their own future. Across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré is no longer viewed as only the leader of Burkina Faso. He is becoming a symbol of something much larger. To many young Africans, he represents a new generation that is tired of dependency, foreign influence, and political systems that fail to improve everyday life. The comparisons with Thomas Sankara are impossible to ignore. Like Sankara decades earlier, Traoré presents himself as a leader focused on sovereignty, national dignity, and control over natural resources. He often appears in military uniform instead of expensive Western-style suits, and his speeches speak directly about pride, sacrifice, and self-determination. For supporters, this simplicity makes him appear closer to ordinary people than many traditional politicians. His rise also reflects deep frustration across the Sahel. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger remain rich in gold, uranium, and other valuable resources. Yet millions of people still live in poverty while insecurity continues to spread. Many citizens have started asking difficult questions. If foreign partnerships and military missions lasted for years, why did violence continue to grow? Why do resource-rich nations remain economically weak? Traoré's message speaks directly to those frustrations. He argues that African nations must stop depending entirely on outside powers and start controlling their own future. That message is spreading far beyond Burkina Faso because many Africans see their own struggles reflected in his words. Still, critics warn that revolutionary language alone cannot solve economic problems or defeat terrorism. History shows that nationalism can inspire hope, but it can also create dangerous expectations if real improvements do not follow. Yet for now, Ibrahim Traoré remains one of the most influential and controversial political figures emerging from modern Africa. The struggle over the Sahel is no longer only about terrorism or political instability. It is increasingly becoming a battle over resources, influence, and the future direction of Africa itself. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger may be among the poorest countries in the world, but together they possess enormous strategic importance because of their gold, uranium, and other natural resources. This is one reason the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, matters far beyond West Africa. Originally created as a security partnership between military governments facing extremist violence, the alliance is now evolving into something much larger. Its leaders openly speak about sovereignty, economic independence, and reducing dependence on former colonial powers. For decades, Western nations maintained strong influence across the Sahel through military cooperation, economic agreements, and political partnerships. But many citizens began losing confidence after years of insecurity, poverty, and failed promises. That frustration created an opening for new international players. Russia expanded its security presence in the region, while Iran started presenting itself as a partner that understands resistance against external pressure. Both countries offer an alternative narrative to the Western model. Instead of speaking mainly about democracy and political reforms, they focus on sovereignty, self-defense, and strategic independence. This growing geopolitical competition worries many Western governments because the Sahel contains some of Africa's most valuable strategic resources. Losing influence there could weaken both economic and political interests that have existed for generations. The message now coming from the Sahel is powerful and deeply symbolic. These nations may struggle financially, but they are increasingly determined to control their own resources, alliances, and political future. As Iran and the Alliance of Sahel States grow closer, Western governments and media organizations are watching with increasing concern. For many officials in Europe and the United States, the rise of military-led governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represents a dangerous shift away from democratic systems and traditional international partnerships. Western critics argue that alliances with countries like Iran and Russia could deepen instability in the region. They warn that military governments often centralize power, weaken political opposition, and reduce democratic freedoms. Some analysts also fear that anti-Western rhetoric is being used to strengthen political control while avoiding accountability for economic hardship and security failures. Those concerns are not entirely without merit. Burkina Faso still faces serious terrorist threats, economic difficulties, and humanitarian challenges. Large parts of the population continue to struggle with poverty and insecurity despite the promises of political change. Critics ask whether revolutionary speeches about sovereignty can truly improve daily life for ordinary citizens. Yet supporters of the AES respond with a difficult question of their own. After decades of Western influence, military cooperation, and international intervention, why does the Sahel remain trapped in violence and underdevelopment? For many citizens, the old system failed to provide security, prosperity, or dignity. That frustration created fertile ground for leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. The deeper problem may not simply be geopolitics. It may be a crisis of trust. Many Africans no longer want outside powers making decisions about their resources, security, and political future. They are not necessarily rejecting cooperation with the West. Instead, they are demanding relationships based more on equality and respect. This is why the message coming from Burkina Faso resonates across parts of Africa. Independence may indeed come with painful costs, but many people have started believing that dependence can cost even more. For all the powerful speeches about sovereignty and resistance, the reality facing Burkina Faso remains extremely difficult. Independence may inspire national pride, but it does not automatically solve economic hardship, insecurity, or political instability. In fact, breaking away from powerful international partners can sometimes create even greater pressure on fragile countries. Burkina Faso continues to face deadly extremist violence across large parts of the country. Thousands of families have been displaced, businesses struggle to operate, and economic growth remains fragile. At the same time, tensions with Western governments risk reducing foreign investment and international financial support. This is the difficult price many nations encounter when trying to redefine their place in the global system. There is also another danger that many supporters of sovereignty rarely discuss openly. Rejecting dependence on one group of foreign powers does not automatically guarantee true independence. Some critics warn that countries like Burkina Faso could eventually become too dependent on new partners such as Russia or Iran for security, weapons, or political backing. That is why real sovereignty requires much more than emotional speeches or symbolic alliances. A truly independent nation needs strong institutions, stable education systems, productive industries, and the ability to protect its own people without relying entirely on outside assistance. History offers many examples of revolutionary movements that inspired enormous hope but later struggled to deliver practical results. National pride can unite people during moments of crisis. But over time, citizens judge governments based on daily realities such as safety, jobs, healthcare, and food prices. This may be the greatest challenge facing Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the Alliance of Sahel States. They are not only trying to resist outside pressure, they are trying to prove that sovereignty can improve the lives of ordinary people instead of becoming only a powerful political slogan. Whether the Alliance of Sahel States ultimately succeeds or fails, one thing is already clear. A new political mood is spreading across parts of Africa. It is driven by frustration, pride, and the belief that African nations should have greater control over their own resources, security, and future. For many supporters of this movement, Captain Ibrahim Traoré represents more than a national leader. He represents a new generation willing to challenge systems that many Africans believe kept the continent dependent for too long. His speeches about sovereignty and dignity resonate because they connect with emotions that exist far beyond Burkina Faso. At the same time, the future remains uncertain. Pan-Africanism has returned as a powerful idea, but ideas alone cannot transform nations. The Alliance of Sahel States must still prove that political independence can bring real stability, economic opportunity, and security for ordinary people. If conditions do not improve, public enthusiasm could eventually fade. Still, the geopolitical significance of this moment cannot be ignored. Iran's support for Burkina Faso shows how global alliances are changing in an increasingly multipolar world. Old powers are losing influence in some regions while new partnerships continue to emerge. The debate is no longer only about East versus West. It is increasingly about whether nations can defend their sovereignty without becoming dependent on another block of power. Across Africa, many people are watching Burkina Faso closely. Some see hope, Others see danger, but almost everyone recognizes that a major shift is taking place. The future of Africa. New political movements may depend on whether leaders like Ibrahim Traoré can transform revolutionary language into practical results. The African Union, supporters of Pan-African ideals, and advocates of Pan-Africanism all understand that the stakes are enormous. Burkina Faso has become one of the central symbols of this historic debate. If you believe Africa is entering a historic turning point, subscribe to the channel and join us for more deep stories shaping the future of the continent.
What if the biggest political shockwave in Africa this week did not come from a coup, a military operation, or a terrorist attack, but from a single sentence spoken by Emmanuel Macron? During the Africa Forward Summit in Kenya, the French president stunned audiences across the continent when he declared that France and its allies were the real Pan-Africanists. Within hours, social media across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger exploded with anger. For many Africans, especially in the Sahel, the statement felt unbelievable. A former colonial power was now claiming ownership of an ideology historically linked to anti-colonial resistance and African liberation. The timing made the controversy even bigger. France was recently pushed out of major parts of the Sahel after years of military presence, rising anti-French protests, and growing support for the alliance of Sahel states. Now many people believe Paris is trying to return through diplomacy, media influence, cultural partnerships, and a new political narrative designed to repair its image across Africa. Supporters of Macron argue that France has changed and now wants a balanced partnership with African nations. Critics say this is simply old influence wearing a modern face. But one question is now dividing the continent. Who truly represents the future of Africa? Is it the traditional Western powers speaking about partnership and democracy, or the new generation of African leaders calling for sovereignty, self-reliance, and complete independence from foreign control? Stay with me until the end, because this story is bigger than France, bigger than Macron, and even bigger than the Sahel itself. It may determine the future direction of Africa for decades to come. And if you enjoy serious discussions about Africa's changing geopolitical future, make sure you subscribe and join this growing community. The controversy surrounding Emmanuel Macron's statement did not begin with a random misunderstanding. It exploded because millions of Africans immediately connected his words to a painful history that still shapes the Sahel today. At the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, Macron declared that France believed in Africa as one united continent, and then made the statement that shocked many observers. He said France and its partners were the real Pan-Africanists. Almost immediately, reactions spread across social media platforms in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Many users accused the French president of trying to rewrite history at a moment when French influence in the region was collapsing. For many Africans, Pan-Africanism is not simply a political slogan. It is deeply connected to anti-colonial struggle, African sovereignty, and resistance against foreign domination. The ideology is associated with historical figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and many others who challenged Western control over African politics and resources. That is why Macron's statement triggered such emotional reactions. Critics argued that France cannot present itself as the defender of Pan-Africanism, while many people in the Sahel still blame Paris for decades of political interference, military influence, and economic control. The outrage became even stronger because France had recently lost major influence in the region. French troops were expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after growing anti-French protests and rising nationalist sentiment. Across West Africa, many young Africans now see France as part of the old system they want to escape. Supporters of Macron defended the speech by saying France has changed and now supports African sovereignty and equal partnership. But for many people in the Sahel, the damage was already done. They did not hear a message of partnership. They heard of former colonial power trying to reclaim moral authority over Africa's future. To understand why so many people in the Sahel no longer trust France, we must go back more than a decade. For years, Paris presented itself as a security partner fighting terrorism across West Africa. French troops entered Mali in 2013 under Operation Serval, after armed extremist groups threatened to advance toward the capital. Later, the mission expanded into Operation Barkhane, one of France's largest military operations abroad. French leaders repeatedly said they were protecting regional stability and helping African governments defend their territory. France also argues that its soldiers fought and died alongside African forces and that Paris intervened only after official requests from African governments. But over time, frustration grew across the Sahel. Despite years of military operations, terrorist attacks continued spreading across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Entire villages were displaced. Insecurity worsened in several areas, and many citizens began asking a dangerous political question. If thousands of foreign troops were present for years, why did violence continue expanding? That frustration slowly transformed into anger. Massive anti-French protests erupted in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. French flags were burned in public demonstrations, while crowds demanded the departure of foreign troops. Social media accelerated the movement, especially among younger Africans who increasingly viewed France as part of the problem, rather than the solution. Critics also accused Paris of maintaining influence through economic systems, military agreements, and political pressure long after formal colonialism had ended. Whether every accusation was true or not became less important than the fact that millions of people believed them. Supporters of France still argue that Paris became an easy scapegoat for deeper regional problems like weak governance, poverty, corruption, and extremist violence, and to some extent, that argument has merit. But politically, perception became reality. Once ordinary citizens stopped believing France was helping the Sahel, the entire relationship began collapsing. And that collapse opened the door for a completely new political movement, now reshaping the future of West Africa. As France was losing influence across the Sahel, a completely different political image began rising across Africa. At the center of that movement stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. To millions of young Africans, Traoré represents far more than a military leader. He has become a symbol of resistance, sovereignty, and African self-determination. His speeches about economic independence, control of natural resources, and freedom from foreign influence spread rapidly across social media platforms. Many supporters now compare him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former president of Burkina Faso, who remains one of the most respected Pan-African figures in modern African history. This is one reason Macron's statement created such a strong emotional reaction. In the eyes of many Africans, Pan-Africanism was built by leaders who fought against foreign domination, not by former colonial powers trying to reinvent themselves as partners of Africa's future. At the same time, the Alliance of Sahel States, made up of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, is promoting a new version of Pan-Africanism centered on sovereignty and security. Their message is simple but powerful. African nations must control their own military policies, their own economies, and their own political future without outside interference. That message resonates strongly with younger generations across West Africa. Many feel their countries remained politically independent on paper, while still depending heavily on foreign military support. international financial systems, and external political influence. Supporters of AES believe the region is finally breaking away from that model. Critics warn that replacing one foreign partner with another could create new forms of dependency, especially with growing Russian influence in the region. But emotionally, the movement continues gaining momentum because it speaks directly to pride, frustration, and identity. This is why the battle between Macron's vision and the AES vision matters so much. It is not only about diplomacy or military alliances anymore. It is a struggle over who gets to define what Pan-Africanism truly means in the 21st century. After losing military influence across large parts of the Sahel, France appears to be changing its strategy in Africa. Instead of relying mainly on soldiers and military bases, Paris is now focusing on diplomacy, investment, culture, technology, and media influence. The Africa Forward Summit was designed to present this new image to the continent. Macron repeatedly speaks about a renewed partnership with Africa. He says France no longer wants to dominate African politics and instead wants balanced cooperation based on mutual respect and sovereignty. French officials now emphasize entrepreneurship, innovation, education, sports, and youth engagement much more than military operations. On the surface, this strategy looks very different from the past. France has reduced or transformed several military bases in Africa. Paris is also increasing investment projects and cultural partnerships in countries like Kenya, Benin, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire. Macron argues that Africa is the youngest and fastest-growing continent in the world, and that France wants to build a modern relationship focused on opportunity rather than control. But many people across the Sahel remain deeply skeptical. For critics, the language may have changed, but the objective remains the same. They believe France is trying to preserve influence through softer methods after losing ground militarily. Instead of direct intervention, they now see media campaigns, diplomatic summits, cultural programs, and economic partnerships becoming the new tools of influence. This explains why Macron's Pan-Africanism statement created such backlash. In the eyes of many Africans, Paris is not simply defending friendship with Africa, it is trying to rebuild legitimacy at a moment when anti-French sentiment is stronger than at any time in recent decades. Supporters of France insist this interpretation is unfair and ignores genuine efforts to reform the relationship. But trust is difficult to rebuild once populations believe they have been controlled for generations. And in today's Africa, perception can be more powerful than official diplomacy. What is happening in the Sahel today is no longer just a regional dispute between France and a few African governments. It has become part of a much larger global struggle over the future of Africa itself. Several major powers are now competing for influence across the continent. France wants to preserve its historical relationships and maintain strategic influence in West Africa. Russia has expanded its security presence by presenting itself as an alternative partner willing to support governments without political pressure. China continues increasing its economic footprint through infrastructure, mining, and development projects. Meanwhile, the United States watches carefully because the Sahel remains strategically important for counterterrorism operations and access to key resources. One of the most sensitive issues is uranium in Niger. For decades, Niger has been an important supplier of uranium used in France's nuclear energy system. That is why political instability and anti-French sentiment in Niger created serious concern in Paris. For many Africans, the uranium issue symbolizes a deeper frustration. They ask why resource-rich nations remain poor, while foreign powers benefit from their natural wealth. At the same time, there is now a massive information war taking place across Africa. Western media often describe AES governments as military regimes aligned with Russia, while many African alternative media platforms portray them as liberation movements fighting neo-colonial influence. Young Africans are increasingly turning away from traditional international media and listening instead to independent online voices. That shift is transforming the political landscape. This is why Macron's statement became so explosive. It entered an environment already filled with distrust, nationalism, geopolitical rivalry, and rising demands for African sovereignty. And so, the battle for Africa today is not only about military power or economic deals. It is about who controls the narrative, who shapes public opinion, and who convinces the next generation that they truly stand with Africa's future. Emmanuel Macron may believe France is entering a new era in Africa. His supporters argue that Paris is finally abandoning the old colonial mindset and trying to build a respectful partnership based on cooperation and development. But across large parts of the Sahel, many people are asking a very different question. If France truly changed, why is distrust toward Paris growing stronger instead of weaker? That question now sits at the center of one of the most important political transformations happening in Africa today. The alliance of Sahel states has become more than a military alliance. For many supporters, it represents a psychological break from decades of dependency and foreign influence. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré have tapped into something powerful across the continent: the desire for dignity, sovereignty, and African self-determination. At the same time, the situation remains complicated. Critics warn that nationalism alone cannot solve insecurity, poverty, unemployment, or economic instability. Others fear that replacing one foreign influence with another could create a new cycle of dependency. The real lesson for African nations is not that one side is perfect and the other side is evil. The real lesson is that Africa must become strong enough to negotiate with every power while remaining controlled by none. Today, the greatest battle is no longer over military bases or political speeches. It is over who gets to shape the future identity of Africa itself. That debate is now shaking the continent from Mali to Burkina Faso, from Niger to the African Union. And whether people support Macron, support AES, or support neither side completely, one thing is certain: the age of passive Africa is ending. A new Pan-African conversation has begun, and figures like Ibrahim Traoré are now standing at the center of that Africa new reality. If you enjoyed this discussion, subscribe for more deep analysis on Pan-Africanism, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and the changing future of Africa. Think about this for a moment. A country had just suffered one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in its recent history. Explosions shook neighborhoods near Bamako. Families were hiding inside their homes. Soldiers were deployed across the capital. And one of Mali's highest-ranking military leaders, Defense Minister General Sadio Camara, was reported dead after a devastating suicide attack. At a moment like this, most world leaders respond with sympathy. They send condolences. They speak carefully because an entire nation is grieving. But Emmanuel Macron chose a different path. Standing before cameras at the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, the French president publicly suggested that Mali had made the wrong decision by expelling French troops for millions across Africa. The message sounded less like concern and more like mockery delivered during a national tragedy. And suddenly, one uncomfortable question returned to the center of African politics. Has France really abandoned its old colonial mindset? Or has the language changed while the attitude stayed the same? Because this was not just about one sentence from Macron. This was about decades of tension between Paris and its former African colonies. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and the growing belief that Africa no longer wants to be managed from outside powers. In today's video, we break down why Macron's comments triggered outrage across the continent, why the AES nations see this as proof of continued French arrogance, and why this moment may symbolize a much larger shift happening across Africa right now. And if you want deeper analysis on African geopolitics and the future of Pan-African sovereignty, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Mali was already bleeding before the controversy even began. The attack on Mali was not a small security incident. It was the kind of event that leaves an entire nation psychologically wounded. Reports described explosions near Bamako, heavy gunfire, emergency deployments, and terrified civilians trapped inside their homes while uncertainty spread across the capital. For many Malians, the most shocking part was the reported death of Defense Minister General Sadio Camara. Whether every early report was fully confirmed or not, the emotional impact was enormous. Mali was suddenly facing the possibility that even its highest military leadership was no longer safe. A nationwide atmosphere of fear quickly emerged. Curfews were imposed. Security forces flooded strategic areas. The government moved rapidly to stabilize the situation alongside support from AES allies and Russian security partners. But emotionally, the damage had already been done. And then came Emmanuel Macron's speech in Nairobi. Instead of beginning with strong condolences, the French president publicly declared that Mali had probably made the wrong decision when it expelled French troops after the military coups. In simple terms, many Africans heard Macron saying, "You pushed France away. And now, look what happened." That single statement exploded across Pan-African media. Critics argued that Macron sounded less like a sympathetic partner and more like a former colonial power trying to prove that African nations could not survive without French oversight. Across social media, many people accused Paris of turning Mali's tragedy into a political lesson. And the timing made everything worse. Families were still grieving. Mali was still under shock. Yet instead of focusing first on solidarity, the conversation suddenly became about whether Bamako had disobeyed Paris and paid the price for it. For decades, France claimed that its relationship with Africa had changed. Emmanuel Macron himself repeatedly declared that the era of France-Afrique was over. According to Paris, the old system of political control, military pressure, and hidden influence belonged to the past. But many Africans never truly believed that story. The term France-Afrique still carries enormous emotional weight across West Africa because it represents a long history of dependency between France and its former colonies. Even after independence, Paris maintained deep influence through military agreements, economic networks, intelligence cooperation, and political alliances. And nowhere was that influence more visible than in the Sahel. For years, French military bases operated across the region. French troops moved freely through countries that were officially sovereign. At the same time, the CFA franc remained one of the most controversial symbols of continued French influence. Critics argued that true sovereignty could never exist while economic systems still depended heavily on Paris. That is why Macron's comments in Nairobi triggered such a powerful reaction. To many people in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the statement sounded like a reminder that France still believed it had the authority to judge which African governments were making the correct choices. And this is where the real crisis begins for Paris. Because Macron speaks the language of partnership, respect, and mutual development. But every time tensions rise in Africa, many people still feel that France reacts like a power that expects obedience rather than equality. For younger Pan-African movements especially, the problem is no longer just military presence. The problem is the belief that African nations are still treated as political spaces that must remain inside a French sphere of influence. France entered Mali in 2013 under Operation Serval with massive international support. At the time, jihadist groups were advancing rapidly across northern Mali, and many people genuinely saw French troops as a force that could prevent the collapse of the country. Initially, the operation was praised. French forces pushed extremist groups back and helped stabilize key areas. But what was supposed to be a short intervention slowly transformed into something much larger. Operation Barkhane expanded across the Sahel with thousands of French troops deployed in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mauritania. And yet, despite nearly a decade of military operations, terrorism continued to spread. Entire regions became more unstable. Civilian deaths increased. Armed groups expanded beyond Mali into neighboring countries. According to international security reports, the Sahel eventually became one of the deadliest terrorism zones in the world. That reality created a dangerous question for Paris. If France had been fighting terrorism for almost 10 years, why did the crisis continue getting worse? Supporters of France argue that the situation would have collapsed completely without French intervention. They say the Sahel governments were weak, underfunded, and facing impossible security challenges. But critics inside Africa ask a different question. Was France truly solving the problem, or simply managing instability while maintaining strategic influence in the region? This is exactly why many people in Mali lost trust in the French presence. From their perspective, years of foreign military operations brought enormous promises but very limited long-term security. Western analysts often respond by pointing out that Mali still faces violence even after French troops left. And that is true. The security crisis did not disappear overnight. But supporters of AES answer with one powerful argument. If the old model was truly successful, then why did so many African nations eventually decide to reject it? The rise of AES changed the political atmosphere across West Africa. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were no longer presenting themselves as isolated military governments. They were presenting themselves as the beginning of a new sovereignty movement inside Africa. And no figure symbolizes that shift more than Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. Across social media and Pan-African circles, Traoré has become far more than a national leader. Supporters describe him as the face of a new African generation that refuses to accept foreign control over security, resources, or political decisions. His speeches about dignity, independence, and economic sovereignty resonate strongly with younger Africans who believe their countries remained politically independent, but economically trapped. Assimi Goïta in Mali follows a similar path. Both leaders consistently argue that African nations must choose their own partners without pressure from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. That is why Mali's growing relationship with Russia became so symbolic. For AES supporters, cooperation with Moscow is not simply about military support. It represents the rejection of a world where France automatically decides who Africa should trust. Of course, critics quickly point out that Russia is not a perfect alternative. Some analysts warn that replacing one foreign influence with another may create new forms of dependency in the future. But many supporters of AES answer that argument with a simple response. At least this time, the choice belongs to Africans themselves, and that may be the most important change happening in the Sahel today. The debate is no longer only about terrorism or military alliances. It is about who has the right to define Africa's future. For millions across the continent, AES represents something larger than politics. It represents the possibility that African nations can finally speak with their own voice, make their own mistakes, and defend their own sovereignty without asking permission from former colonial powers. What truly worries many Western governments is not simply the existence of military regimes in the Sahel. Africa has experienced coups before. The deeper concern is that a growing number of African nations are beginning to openly challenge the old geopolitical order that dominated the continent for decades. For years, Western powers presented themselves as Africa's primary security and development partners. But now, many countries are asking uncomfortable questions about dependency, sovereignty, and who truly benefits from these relationships. That is why the conflict between France and AES has become much bigger than Mali alone. Western critics argue that nationalism and anti-French rhetoric cannot solve terrorism, poverty, or weak institutions. They warn that emotional speeches about sovereignty are meaningless unless governments also improve security, education, healthcare, and economic stability. And to some extent, those criticisms are valid. Real sovereignty requires more than military independence. It requires functioning institutions, stable economies, and long-term development. Otherwise, political liberation can easily become another cycle of instability. But supporters of AES believe something equally important. They believe that no country can build true stability while remaining psychologically dependent on outside powers. In their eyes, sovereignty may be difficult, risky, and expensive, but dependency is far more dangerous in the long run. That is the lesson many Africans are now debating, not whether France is entirely good or entirely bad, not whether Russia is a perfect alternative, but whether African nations finally have the courage to choose their own direction, even if the road ahead is uncertain. And perhaps that is the biggest shift happening in Africa today. For the first time in decades, many countries are no longer asking how to be protected. They are asking how to be respected. So in the end, the controversy surrounding Emmanuel Macron was never only about one speech in Nairobi. It became symbolic of something much deeper happening across Africa today. When Mali was mourning its dead, many Africans expected compassion from France. Instead, they heard a message that sounded like a warning that nations which reject French influence may suffer the consequences, whether Macron intended it that way or not. That is how millions of people across the continent interpreted his words, and that is why the reaction became so emotional. Because this debate is no longer only about counterterrorism operations or military alliances, it is about memory. It is about dignity. It is about whether African nations truly have the right to choose their own future without being judged by former colonial powers. The countries of AES understand that sovereignty comes with risks. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger know the road ahead will not be easy. Terrorism remains dangerous. Economic pressure remains real. International criticism continues to grow. But for supporters of Pan-African movements, something historic is happening. A new generation of African leaders is openly declaring that dependence can no longer be the foundation of Africa's future. Figures like Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Assimi Goïta have become symbols of a larger movement connected to Pan-Africanism, the African Union, and the growing demand for an Africa new vision built on sovereignty and self-respect. Whether people agree with them or not, one fact is becoming impossible to ignore. Africa is changing, and perhaps the biggest mistake France can make is believing that the old relationship can still survive under a different name. If this video resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Do you believe Macron was simply being honest? Or did his comments reveal the true face of French policy in Africa? Subscribe for more deep analysis on Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré, Pan-African Geopolitics, and the Future of African Sovereignty. West Africa is shaking under the weight of terrorism, military coups, collapsing public trust, and growing anger toward the old foreign powers that once claimed they could stabilize the region. Across the Sahel, entire communities are living between fear and uncertainty, while governments struggle to stop armed groups from expanding deeper into African territory. Yet, in the middle of this dangerous crisis, something unexpected just happened. ECOWAS, the same regional bloc that once tried to isolate Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, has now sent a special envoy directly to Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the Alliance of Sahel States. This meeting was not an ordinary diplomatic visit. For many Africans, it was a sign that the balance of power in West Africa is changing faster than anyone expected. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer acting like isolated military governments under pressure. Instead, they are building a new security alliance, tightening borders, launching military operations, and openly challenging the old geopolitical order that dominated the region for decades. At the same time, many ECOWAS countries remain trapped in instability, political division, and worsening insecurity. That reality is forcing difficult questions across Africa. Is the AES becoming a new model for African sovereignty and self-defense? Has the old system already begun to lose control of West Africa? If you believe Africa is entering a new era of sovereignty and resistance, make sure you subscribe and stay with us until the very end. For years, ECOWAS positioned itself as the main authority in West Africa. After the military takeovers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the organization responded with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and threats of isolation. Many international observers expected the AES countries to collapse under economic and political pressure. But that never happened. Across the Sahel, terrorism is no longer an isolated crisis hidden in remote desert regions. It has become a growing wave of instability threatening the entire future of West Africa. Armed groups linked to JNYM, ISGS, Boko Haram, and other extremist networks continue to move across borders with deadly flexibility. Entire villages have been attacked. Thousands of families have been displaced. In many rural communities, people no longer ask whether violence will arrive. They ask when. One of the biggest fears inside the AES today is that weak border control allowed terrorist networks to spread for years without serious resistance. Vast desert routes connecting Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Libya, and northern Nigeria became corridors for weapons trafficking, fuel smuggling, and militant movement. According to many security analysts in the region, open borders without strong security coordination created dangerous vulnerabilities that armed groups exploited repeatedly. This is why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have dramatically changed their approach. Instead of waiting for international missions or foreign coalitions to secure their territory, the AES governments are increasing military patrols, tightening border checks, expanding intelligence cooperation, and launching more aggressive counterterrorism operations. At the same time, the crisis is spreading beyond the Sahel itself. Countries like Benin and Togo are now facing increasing security threats near their northern borders. Coastal West Africa is beginning to realize that the instability consuming the Sahel could eventually move southward if the region remains divided and weak. For ordinary African families, these geopolitical debates are deeply personal. Parents want children who can safely attend school. Farmers want to work without fear of armed attacks. Traders want roads free from kidnappings and ambushes. In the eyes of many citizens, survival matters more than political slogans. For decades, many Africans were told that Western military partnerships and foreign intervention would eventually bring peace to the Sahel. Foreign bases expanded across the region. International counterterrorism missions operated for years. Billions of dollars were spent in the name of stabilization. Yet, despite all those promises, insecurity continued to spread across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This growing frustration created a deep crisis of confidence among ordinary citizens. Across many African communities, people started asking difficult questions. If foreign military operations were successful, why were terrorist groups becoming stronger? Why were villages still falling under attack? Why were young Africans still dying while foreign powers claimed to be protecting the region? That frustration opened the door for the rise of the AES. Unlike the older political structures tied closely to foreign influence, the Alliance of Sahel States presented itself as something different. It promoted the idea that Africans must defend Africa with their own strength, their own military cooperation, and their own political decisions. For many citizens, that message carried enormous emotional power. The return of Pan-African sentiment has become impossible to ignore. Across social media platforms, radio discussions, and political debates, growing numbers of Africans are expressing support for leaders who openly challenge foreign pressure and demand greater sovereignty. To many supporters, the AES is no longer viewed simply as a military alliance. It is becoming a symbol of resistance, dignity, and self-determination. This does not mean every African fully supports the policies of the AES governments, but many people clearly believe that the old system failed to provide security, stability, or respect for African sovereignty. That belief alone is already reshaping political conversations across West Africa. Among the leaders emerging from the political transformation of the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has become the most recognized figure across West Africa. To his supporters, he represents a new generation of African leadership that refuses to accept foreign pressure, insecurity, and dependency as permanent realities. To his critics, he represents the growing influence of military rule in regional politics. But regardless of opinion, Ibrahim Traoré has already changed the political conversation inside Africa. Unlike many traditional politicians, Traoré built his image around military discipline, sovereignty, and direct involvement in the security crisis affecting ordinary citizens. He often appears in military uniform alongside soldiers rather than inside luxurious political settings. That image resonates strongly with many Africans who believe older political elites failed to protect the population from terrorism, corruption, and instability. For supporters of the AES, Traoré symbolizes resistance against dependency. His speeches regularly emphasize that Africa must defend its own territory, protect its own resources, and build military strength without relying entirely on foreign powers. Across social media platforms, his popularity has spread far beyond Burkina Faso. Many young Africans now see him as part of a broader Pan-African movement focused on dignity, sovereignty, and self-respect. At the same time, Western governments and international organizations remain concerned about the direction of the AES. Critics argue that military governments could weaken democratic institutions and normalize coups as political solutions. Some analysts also warn that military success alone cannot solve the economic and social problems damaging the Sahel. However, many citizens inside Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger respond with a different argument. They believe security must come first before political reforms can truly succeed. In their eyes, any government that cannot protect roads, villages, and families eventually loses legitimacy. That is why the recent meeting between ECOWAS and Ibrahim Traoré carried enormous symbolic importance. Not long ago, the AES leadership was treated as isolated. Today, ECOWAS itself is seeking dialogue, showing that the balance of power in West Africa may already be shifting. As the influence of the AES continues to grow, West Africa is also entering a new geopolitical competition involving outside powers searching for influence across the continent. Russia and Turkey have become two of the most important new partners for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Unlike the older Western model of intervention, these relationships are often presented as more flexible and based on mutual strategic interests rather than political conditions. Russia has expanded military cooperation with several Sahel governments through training, equipment support, and security partnerships. At the same time, Turkey has increased its presence through defense technology, military cooperation, and economic partnerships. For the AES leadership, these new alliances represent an opportunity to diversify partnerships and reduce dependence on traditional Western powers. However, this shift also raises serious questions. Some critics warn that replacing one foreign dependency with another cannot create true sovereignty. Others argue that African countries must avoid becoming battlegrounds for global power competition between East and West. At the same time, Western governments remain deeply concerned about the rise of the AES. Many fear that the growing popularity of military-led governments could weaken democratic institutions across Africa and inspire similar political movements elsewhere in the region. There are also concerns that continued instability may damage investment, economic growth, and humanitarian conditions. Still, many Africans respond with a different perspective. They argue that promises of democracy mean little when insecurity continues to destroy communities year after year. For them, the real struggle is not simply about elections or alliances. It is about restoring hope, security, and dignity to ordinary people. The future of West Africa may now depend on whether ECOWAS and the AES can find a way to cooperate despite their deep political differences. Terrorist groups do not respect borders, political systems, or regional organizations. As insecurity spreads across the Sahel and toward coastal nations, the pressure for coordination is becoming impossible to ignore. For many analysts, the recent dialogue between ECOWAS and the AES signals the beginning of a new political reality. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer viewed only as isolated military governments under sanctions. They are increasingly being seen as a regional bloc with growing influence, military coordination, and ideological impact across Africa. At the same time, the challenges facing the AES remain enormous. Military operations alone cannot solve poverty, unemployment, weak infrastructure, or the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of people across the Sahel. Long-term stability will require not only security victories, but also economic development, education, and trust between governments and citizens. Still, one lesson has become impossible to ignore. Many Africans now believe that the continent must strengthen its own ability to defend its people, secure its borders, and shape its own political future without permanent dependence on outside powers. West Africa is entering one of the most dangerous and transformative moments in its modern history. The region now stands between two possible futures. One path leads deeper into division, terrorism, foreign manipulation, and endless instability. The other path could lead toward a stronger and more self-reliant Africa capable of defending its own people and controlling its own destiny. The unexpected meeting between ECOWAS and the AES revealed something very important. The political map of West Africa is changing, whether the old powers accept it or not. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already become major actors shaping the future of the Sahel. Their alliance has forced difficult conversations about sovereignty, security, and the true meaning of African independence in the modern world. At the center of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, whose rise has inspired both admiration and controversy across the continent. To many supporters of Pan-African ideals, Ibrahim Traoré represents a new generation determined to protect African dignity against insecurity and foreign pressure. Others remain cautious, warning that military power alone cannot guarantee long-term prosperity or democratic stability. But one reality is clear. Millions of Africans are searching for new leadership models because too many old systems fail to deliver peace and security. The growing influence of the AES reflects not only military cooperation, but also a deeper emotional shift happening across Africa's new political consciousness. As the African Union, AES, and the Alliance of Sahel States navigate this uncertain future, the entire continent is watching closely. The struggle unfolding in Burkina Faso and across the Sahel is no longer only about territory or politics. It is about identity, sovereignty, and the future direction of Pan-Africanism itself. If you believe Africa deserves security, dignity, and sovereignty, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories shaping the future of the continent. When Somalia's Interior Security Minister arrived in Ouagadougou to meet Captain Ibrahim Traoré, many people outside Africa saw it as just another diplomatic visit. But across the continent, the message felt much bigger. A nation that has spent years fighting terrorism was now looking toward Burkina Faso for answers. That alone surprised many observers. For decades, African countries facing insurgencies usually turned first to France, the United States, or international military coalitions. Yet today, some leaders are beginning to look toward another African nation instead, a country once described only through poverty, instability, and violence is suddenly being discussed as a possible model of resistance and security cooperation. Why? Why would Somalia, a nation that has battled al-Shabaab for years, seek closer security ties with Burkina Faso? The answer may reveal a major shift happening inside Africa itself. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso is trying to build something different. Not simply another military campaign against terrorism, but a broader vision based on self-reliance, national dignity, and African-led security cooperation. Supporters believe he is helping Africa rediscover confidence in its own strength after decades of dependency on outside powers. And that is exactly why this story matters far beyond Burkina Faso. Because the real question is no longer whether terrorism exists in Africa. The real question is who Africans now trust to fight it. If you enjoy deep stories about Africa's changing future, remember to subscribe because this channel follows the leaders, movements, and turning points reshaping the continent today. Somalia's visit to Burkina Faso was not symbolic theater. It reflected a growing belief that Ouagadougou may now represent something many African nations have been searching for: a homegrown response to insecurity. The visit from Somalia also carried another message that many international observers immediately understood. Burkina Faso was no longer being treated only as a country in crisis. It was beginning to be viewed as a security partner. Somalia and Burkina Faso share painful similarities. Both nations have spent years fighting extremist groups that attack villages, destroy schools, displace families, and weaken local economies. In both countries, terrorism has become more than a military issue. It has become part of everyday life. For ordinary citizens, the consequences are devastating. Farmers abandon their fields because armed groups control rural roads. Parents fear sending children to school. Entire communities are forced to flee with almost nothing. In many areas, survival itself becomes uncertain. That is why the meeting between Somali officials and Ibrahim Traoré mattered so much. Somalia was not simply looking for diplomatic friendship, it was looking for practical cooperation in intelligence sharing, security training, and counterterrorism coordination. And perhaps most importantly, Somalia was looking at a country trying to fight back without depending entirely on foreign military structures. This growing interest in Burkina Faso also reflects frustration across parts of Africa. For years, Western powers promised stability in the Sahel through military operations, foreign bases, and counterterrorism missions. Yet, violence continued spreading across borders. Many Africans began asking difficult questions. If thousands of foreign troops, advanced technology, and international funding could not stop the crisis after so many years, then what exactly needed to change? That question would eventually help transform Ibrahim Traoré from a national military leader into a continental political symbol. Across the Sahel, frustration toward Western military strategy did not appear overnight. France maintained a military presence in parts of West Africa for years. The United States also invested heavily in intelligence operations, surveillance programs, and counterterrorism support across the region. But despite all of this, insecurity often became worse instead of better. Armed groups expanded into rural territories. Attacks spread across borders. Millions of civilians were displaced. In some communities, people began feeling that foreign intervention had become permanent, while peace remained temporary. This growing anger fueled massive anti-French demonstrations in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Protesters waved national flags and demanded greater sovereignty over security decisions. Many no longer wanted outside powers deciding the future of African nations. Still, the situation is more complicated than simple slogans. Not every failure can be blamed on Western countries alone. The Sahel crisis is also connected to poverty, corruption, weak state institutions, ethnic tensions, illegal arms trafficking, and decades of political instability. Even the strongest military operation struggles when these deeper problems remain unresolved. That is why Ibrahim Traoré's message resonates with many Africans. He argues that security cannot